The billionaire CEO pulled his baseball cap low and boarded one of his own airline's aircraft. Nobody recognized Damon Richards. Not the flight attendants, not the captain, not even the crew supervisor who was supposed to be commanding this Richards Airways commercial flight. He had boarded undercover for a reason, but nothing could have prepared him for what he heard next. Desperate sobbing echoing from the first-class galley. Through the narrow aisle, a silver name badge lay abandoned on the luxurious carpet. Isabella Chen, senior flight attendant. The crying wasn't just sadness, it was the sound of someone whose world was falling apart at 40,000 feet. Damon's blood ran cold. 3 months ago, corporate had received glowing reports about this route. Perfect crew satisfaction scores, 0 complaints. But the woman crying in that galley told a completely different story. As he stood frozen in the golden light of the first-class cabin, one terrifying question burned through his mind. If this was happening on one of his airline's flights, under his own brand, what else had he missed? I am the billionaire butler, and for 37 years I have served as the personal butler to the most powerful families in the United States. I've worked for tech magnates, oil barons, and media dynasties. I've witnessed fortunes built and empires crumble. I've seen the secrets money can buy and the truths it desperately tries to hide. From the marble corridors of Manhattan penthouses to private jets crossing continents, I've been present in conversations that shaped nations and decisions that moved billions. These are stories you were never meant to hear, but ones you need to know. Today, I must tell you about Damon Richards, the young and brilliant CEO who inherited Richards Airways from his father and turned it into the most luxurious airline in the world, and how a covert flight aboard his own aircraft uncovered corruption so deep it would shake his empire to its core. What began as a routine inspection became the 6 most important hours of his life, and mine. Stay with me, because what happened 40,000 feet in the air will forever change the way you see leadership, loyalty, and the true cost of looking the other way. The story begins 3 months before that fateful flight, in the opulent boardroom of Richards Airways headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. I was serving afternoon tea to the executive committee when Damon received what should have been excellent news. The quarterly reports showed record profits, industry-leading customer satisfaction scores, and perfect crew performance metrics across the entire fleet. On paper, Richards Airways was soaring higher than ever before. But Damon Richards was not a man who trusted paper alone. At 34, he had inherited more than just an airline from his father. He had inherited the wisdom that true wealth comes from understanding every aspect of your empire, especially the parts that powerful people prefer to keep hidden. His father, Marcus Richards, had built the company from a single cargo plane into a global luxury carrier by following one simple principle: the people closest to your customers know truths that boardrooms never discover. That principle would prove more valuable than Damon could possibly imagine. I watched him study those perfect reports with the skeptical eye of someone who had learned that perfection often masks the deepest problems. In my years serving his family, I had observed this particular talent many times. While other wealthy heirs trusted their managers blindly, Damon possessed the rare ability to sense when something beneath the surface was wrong. It was a skill that had saved the company millions and prevented countless scandals. But this time, the stakes would be infinitely higher. The decision to go undercover came during our weekly private briefing in his study. I was polishing the crystal decanters when he voiced the concern that had been troubling him for weeks. "Winston," he said, his voice carrying the weight of inherited responsibility, "when reports are too good to be true, they usually are. I need to see what's really happening on our flights, away from the sanitized version management presence. I have learned through decades of service that the greatest leaders are those who fear comfort more than conflict." Damon's instinct to investigate personally, rather than send subordinates, revealed the character that had earned him respect throughout the aviation industry. But even I could not have predicted what his courage would uncover. The preparation for his undercover mission was meticulous. We created a complete false identity, David Chen, a tech consultant traveling frequently for business. The background was solid enough to withstand casual inquiry, but unremarkable enough to blend into the crowd of high-paying passengers who regularly flew Richards Airways premium routes. Damon studied the persona for weeks, adjusting his speech patterns, his posture, even his clothing choices to match someone who had money but not generational wealth. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Gone was the confident stride of a man who owned everything around him. In its place appeared the slightly nervous energy of someone who worked hard for the privilege of flying first class. He practiced the role until it became natural, understanding that the slightest slip could compromise the entire operation, but most importantly, he prepared himself mentally for whatever truth he might discover. On the evening of October 15th, I drove him to JFK International Airport in an unremarkable sedan, rather than his usual limousine. As we pulled up to the departure terminal, he turned to me with an expression I had rarely seen in all our years together. Genuine uncertainty about what lay ahead. "Winston," he said quietly, "I have a feeling that after tonight, everything changes. I have served enough powerful men to recognize the weight of prophetic words." As I watched him disappear into the terminal crowds, I knew I was witnessing the beginning of something that would either strengthen his empire or threaten to destroy it entirely. Flight 447 from New York to Los Angeles was Richards Airways' flagship route, a 6-hour journey that epitomized everything the company represented. The aircraft itself was a masterpiece of luxury aviation, a modified Boeing 777 with only 60 seats, each one a private suite that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The passenger manifest read like a Forbes list, but tonight it included one name that would change everything: David Chen, Seat 3A. As Damon settled into his first-class suite, I know he was struck by the irony of paying $50,000 for a seat on his own airline, but the price was necessary for the disguise. Only passengers willing to spend that amount commanded the indifference of crew members who had seen every variety of wealth and power. To them, he was simply another successful businessman who could afford the ultimate in air travel luxury. The crew for Flight 447 consisted of 8 flight attendants, all handpicked for their experience and discretion. Leading them was Isabella Chen, a woman whose surname similarity to Damon's fake identity was pure coincidence, but whose dedication to service had made her legendary within the company. At 31, Isabella had worked for Richards Airways for 7 years, earning consistent praise from passengers and management alike. Her personnel file, which I had reviewed as part of the mission preparation, showed a perfect record. Never late, never absent, never a single complaint. What that file did not show was the increasingly desperate situation that was slowly destroying her life. Captain Blake Morrison commanded the flight from the cockpit, but his real power extended far beyond aviation. As regional crew supervisor for the East Coast Fleet, Morrison controlled schedules, assignments, and most crucially, the recommendations that determined who received benefits and who did not. At 48, he had built a reputation as an efficient manager who kept labor costs low and customer satisfaction high. Corporate headquarters considered him invaluable. They had no idea he was a predator disguised as a professional. The first hour of the flight proceeded exactly as Damon expected. The service was flawless, the attention to detail impeccable, and the crew's professionalism worthy of the premium passengers were paying. Isabella personally oversaw his welcome champagne service, her smile genuine and her manner perfectly calibrated to the expectations of the ultra-wealthy. Everything appeared exactly as the glowing reports had described. But Damon possessed the patience of a true investigator. He had learned from his father that surface impressions, no matter how convincing, rarely told the complete story. So he waited, and he watched, and he listened for the subtle signs that would reveal what management reports could never capture. The first crack in the perfect facade appeared during the second hour of flight, when Isabella excused herself for what should have been a routine break. But instead of the confident stride he had observed earlier, her movement toward the rear galley carried a subtle urgency that suggested something beyond normal crew responsibilities. It was a small detail that most passengers would never notice, but Damon had been trained to observe human behavior as carefully as financial statements. 20 minutes passed before Isabella returned to the passenger cabin, and when she did, her smile seemed forced in a way that made Damon's investigative instincts flare. Her eyes held a redness that suggested recent tears, hastily concealed with makeup. But most telling was the way she avoided eye contact with passengers who tried to engage her in conversation. Something had happened during that break that had shaken her professional composure. That was when Damon heard it, the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Muffled sobbing, barely audible over the aircraft's engines, drifting from the forward galley, where crew members prepared meals and stored service items. The sound was carefully suppressed, the kind of crying someone does when they cannot afford to be discovered but can no longer contain their anguish. It was the sound of someone whose world was falling apart at 40,000 feet, with nowhere to run and no one to turn to for help. Damon's blood went cold as he recognized the voice. Isabella Chen, the model employee whose perfect record had impressed corporate executives, was crying like her life was ending, and perhaps it was. The decision to investigate further required careful consideration. Moving around the aircraft too freely would draw attention from both crew and passengers, potentially compromising his cover. But the desperation in Isabella's muffled sobs suggested a crisis that demanded immediate attention. Drawing on every lesson his father had taught him about balancing caution with decisive action, Damon made his choice. He approached the galley under the pretense of seeking additional amenities, a reasonable request from a first-class passenger, but what he discovered there would shatter every assumption he had made about his company's operations. Isabella was huddled in the narrow space between service carts, her hands shaking as she held what appeared to be medical documents. Even from a distance, Damon could see the letterhead of Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and the overwhelming numbers that covered the pages. The bills were astronomical, far beyond what any airline employee could afford, even with the comprehensive health insurance that Richards Airways was supposed to provide. But it was Isabella's whispered phone conversation that revealed the true scope of the crisis she faced. "I understand, Dr. Martinez, but the insurance company says the procedure isn't covered under my current plan." Isabella's voice was barely audible, but Damon caught every devastating word. "Captain Morrison told me that my employment status changed last month, and the new classification doesn't include the cardiac surgery benefit. Yes, I know Emma needs the operation. No, I don't have $47,000. I'll find a way, I promise. Deal." The conversation ended with Isabella's quiet sobs resuming, but Damon had heard enough to understand the magnitude of what was happening. Emma Chen, Isabella's 8-year-old daughter, needed heart surgery to survive. But somehow, despite Isabella's perfect employment record and years of loyal service, the insurance that should have covered the procedure had been mysteriously changed. Someone had altered her benefits deliberately, condemning a child to potential death while her mother served champagne to passengers who spent more on a single meal than Isabella earned in a month. The cruelty was breathtaking, but it was only the beginning. Damon retreated to his seat with his mind racing, but he forced himself to maintain the calm demeanor of David Chen, successful consultant. The investigation required patience and strategy, not the immediate confrontation that his emotions demanded. Over the next hour, he began piecing together clues that painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as corporate efficiency. He observed the subtle interactions between Isabella and other crew members, noting the way they offered quiet support that suggested her situation was not unique. He watched Captain Morrison emerge from the cockpit for what appeared to be routine passenger interaction, but Damon noticed how the man's presence caused visible tension among the crew. Most telling was the way Morrison's eyes lingered on Isabella, with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with professional oversight. The pattern became clear during the third hour of flight, when Morrison called Isabella to the forward galley for what he announced as a routine performance review. Adil, through the partially open galley curtain, Damon could observe their interaction while maintaining his cover as a passenger reading financial reports. What he witnessed made his hands clench into fists. Morrison stood while Isabella remained seated at the small crew table, a deliberate power dynamic that immediately established dominance. In his hands were personnel files and what appeared to be schedule modifications, but his body language radiated the casual cruelty of someone who enjoyed wielding absolute control over another person's fate. Isabella. Morrison's voice carried the false concern of a predator disguised as a protector. I've been reviewing your recent performance metrics, and I'm afraid there are some concerning trends. Damon watched Isabella's face drain of color as she realized what was happening. This was not a performance review based on actual job performance. This was a carefully orchestrated manipulation designed to justify further abuse while maintaining plausible deniability. Sir, I don't understand. Isabella's voice remained professionally controlled despite the obvious fear in her eyes. My passenger satisfaction scores have been consistently excellent, and I haven't missed a single shift in 7 years. Morrison's smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. Performance isn't just about punctuality, Isabella. It's about attitude, flexibility, and understanding your place in the company hierarchy. Recently, I've noticed some concerning behaviors that suggest you might not fully appreciate the opportunities Richards Airways has provided. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, but Damon had heard enough to understand Morrison's strategy. By creating vague performance concerns that existed only in Morrison's interpretation, he was building a paper trail that would justify any future actions he chose to take. Isabella's perfect record was being systematically rewritten to serve Morrison's agenda, and there was nothing she could do to defend herself without risking immediate termination. But the most chilling moment came when Morrison addressed Isabella's insurance situation directly. I understand your daughter has some medical needs, Morrison said with fake sympathy, but company policy is very clear about benefit eligibility. Employees who demonstrate reliability issues or attitude problems may find their status adjusted accordingly. It's unfortunate, but these policies exist to protect the company's interests. Damon realized he was witnessing the casual destruction of a family's future, carried out with the methodical precision of someone who had perfected this form of abuse. Morrison was using Emma Chen's medical crisis as leverage to ensure Isabella's complete compliance with whatever demands he chose to make. The threat was clear: cooperate completely or watch your daughter die. The revelation hit Damon with the force of physical impact. This was not isolated misconduct by a single bad manager. This was systematic exploitation carried out under his company's name, using his policies as weapons against the most vulnerable employees. The perfect performance reports he had been receiving were lies built on the suffering of people like Isabella, who had no choice but to endure abuse in silence. But Damon Richards had not built his reputation by accepting injustice, even when it operated under the cover of corporate efficiency. The time for observation was ending. Soon, it would be time to act. The fourth hour of Flight 447 brought a development that would provide Damon with the evidence he needed to expose Morrison's operation completely. As the aircraft reached its cruising altitude over the Midwest, Morrison made an announcement that would prove to be his downfall. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison speaking. Due to some minor scheduling adjustments, we'll be conducting our monthly crew evaluation during this flight. This is routine procedure and will not affect your service in any way. To the passengers, this announcement meant nothing, But Damon understood its true significance immediately. Morrison was using the confined environment of the aircraft to conduct what amounted to psychological warfare against his crew, knowing they had no escape and no witnesses who would understand what they were seeing. Over the next hour, Morrison systematically called each crew member to the forward galley for individual evaluations. From his vantage point in Seat 3A, Damon could observe enough of these interactions to understand the pattern of abuse that had been hidden from corporate oversight for months, possibly years. Junior flight attendant Sarah Williams, 23 years old and new to the company, emerged from her evaluation visibly shaken. Damon watched her hands tremble as she served beverages, and he noticed how she kept glancing nervously toward the galley where Morrison had just finished threatening her job security over imaginary infractions. Flight attendant Marcus Thompson, a 15-year veteran with an impeccable record, came out of his meeting with the forced smile of someone who had just been humiliated but could not afford to show it. The way he moved suggested a man whose dignity had been systematically stripped away, leaving only the desperate compliance of someone trapped by economic necessity. But it was Isabella's second evaluation that provided Damon with the smoking gun he needed. As Isabella entered the galley for what Morrison called a follow-up discussion, Damon made a decision that would change everything. Using the pretense of needing to stretch his legs, he moved to a position where he could hear their conversation clearly while maintaining his cover as a restless passenger. What he heard next was a complete confession to crimes that would destroy Morrison's career and potentially send him to federal prison. "Isabella, I want to be very clear about your situation." Morrison's voice carried the casual authority of someone who believed himself untouchable. "Your daughter's surgery is scheduled for next month, correct? $47,000 is a lot of money for someone in your position." "Yes, sir." Isabella's response was barely audible, but Damon could hear the desperation that colored every word. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison continued, with the methodical precision of a predator who had perfected his approach. "Your employment classification is going to be adjusted to reflect your recent performance issues. Part-time temporary status, no benefits, irregular scheduling. Of course, this means no insurance coverage for expensive procedures." Damon felt his hands shake with rage as he realized what he was hearing. Morrison was not just altering Isabella's benefits arbitrarily. He was using her daughter's medical crisis as leverage for something far more sinister. However, Morrison's voice took on the false generosity of someone offering poison disguised as medicine. "I'm willing to consider reinstating your full-time status and insurance coverage, but it would require a demonstration of your commitment to maintaining positive working relationships with management." The implication was clear, and Damon felt physically ill as he understood the full scope of Morrison's abuse. This was not just wage theft or benefit fraud. This was sexual coercion using a child's life as leverage, carried out at 40,000 feet, where the victim had no escape and no witnesses who would be believed. "I need you to think very carefully about what your daughter's life is worth to you," Morrison continued, his voice carrying the satisfied malice of someone who believed he held absolute power. "Because right now I'm the only thing standing between Emma and a very tragic outcome." Isabella's response was a whispered sob that carried more pain than any scream could have conveyed. She was trapped in a nightmare scenario where refusing Morrison's demands meant watching her daughter die, but complying meant participating in her own systematic destruction. Damon had heard enough. The evidence was overwhelming, and the situation had moved far beyond corporate misconduct into criminal territory. But he also knew that confronting Morrison directly at 40,000 feet could endanger the safety of everyone aboard the aircraft. The situation required careful strategy and perfect timing. As Isabella emerged from the galley, her face pale and her hands shaking, Damon made eye contact with her for the first time during the flight. What she saw in his expression must have conveyed something beyond normal passenger concern, because she paused in her movement down the aisle. "Excuse me," Damon said quietly. "Are you feeling all right? You look like you might need some assistance." Isabella's training took over, and she forced a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, sir. Just a little turbulence affecting me more than usual. Is there anything I can get for you?" But Damon had seen the momentary hope that flickered in her expression when she realized someone had noticed her distress. In that moment, he made a decision that would reveal his true identity and change the course of the flight entirely. "Actually," Damon said, reaching into his wallet and pulling out a business card that would shatter Morrison's world completely, "I think there's quite a lot I can do for you." The business card was simple: Damon Richards, Chief Executive Officer, Richards Airways. But its impact on Isabella was immediate and overwhelming. Her eyes widened as she processed what she was seeing, and for a moment Damon thought she might collapse from the shock of realization. "You're—" Isabella's whisper was almost inaudible over the aircraft's engines. "I'm the owner of this airline," Damon confirmed quietly, "and I've been listening to everything that just happened in that galley. We need to talk, but not here. Can you meet me in the rear cabin service area in 10 minutes? Isabella nodded, her hands still trembling, but now from relief rather than fear. For the first time in months, someone with the power to help her actually knew what was happening. As she walked away to complete her duties, Damon felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, like a familiar burden. In the next few hours, he would have to make decisions that would affect not just Isabella and her daughter, but every employee who had suffered under Morrison's regime of terror. The confrontation that would follow would be swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating to everyone who had participated in the systematic abuse of his crew members. But first, he needed to document everything Morrison had revealed, because what was about to happen would require evidence that could withstand any legal challenge Morrison might attempt. The rear cabin service area of Flight 447 was designed for discreet crew consultations away from passenger observation. When Isabella arrived exactly 10 minutes later, her professional composure had returned, but Damon could see the exhaustion that years of abuse had etched into her features. "Please, sit down," Damon said gently, gesturing to one of the crew seats. "I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to tell me everything that's been happening. Not just tonight, but everything Morrison has done to you and the other crew members." Isabella's story unfolded over the next 20 minutes, and with each detail, Damon's understanding of the systematic corruption within his own company deepened. Morrison's abuse was not random or impulsive. It was methodical, calculated, and designed to exploit the most vulnerable employees while maintaining perfect deniability. The scheme worked like this. Morrison would identify crew members with pressing financial needs or personal vulnerabilities. Single mothers like Isabella, employees supporting elderly parents, anyone whose circumstances made them desperate to maintain their employment. Then he would systematically manipulate their work classifications, cutting benefits and reducing hours while maintaining the appearance of performance-based decisions. But the most insidious part of Morrison's operation was how he used the airline's isolated work environment to his advantage. Flight crews spent days together in confined spaces, traveling across time zones with limited outside contact. It was the perfect setting for psychological manipulation and coercion, because victims had no escape and no reliable witnesses. "He's been doing this for at least 2 years, Isabella explained, her voice growing stronger as she realized she was finally being heard by someone who could act. "Sarah, Marcus, Jennifer from the international crew, at least a dozen others that I know of. We've all had our benefits cut or schedules manipulated, always with just enough plausible justification to avoid formal complaints." "What about Emma's insurance?" Damon asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Isabella's composure cracked slightly as she explained how Morrison had discovered her daughter's heart condition during a routine conversation about family. Within weeks, her insurance status had been mysteriously downgraded, eliminating coverage for the expensive cardiac surgery Emma desperately needed. He said it was a computer error at first, Isabella continued, but when I tried to appeal through normal channels, every request was denied. Then he started making it clear that my insurance status could be reviewed if I was willing to show proper appreciation for his management style. The implications were clear, and Damon felt a rage building that he had rarely experienced in his business career. Morrison was using children's lives as leverage for sexual coercion, all while maintaining the professional facade that had fooled corporate oversight for years. Isabella, Damon said carefully, I need you to know that everything Morrison told you about insurance classifications and company policies is a lie. Your daughter's surgery should have been covered from day one, and I'm going to make sure it happens immediately. But first, I need your help to make sure Morrison never does this to anyone else. The relief that flooded Isabella's expression was followed quickly by determination. What do you need me to do? I need you to help me document everything that's about to happen, Damon explained. Because in about 10 minutes, Captain Morrison is going to learn that his career in aviation is over. The confrontation began at exactly 4:47 p.m. Pacific time as Flight 447 crossed into California airspace. Damon had chosen his timing carefully, waiting until the aircraft was close enough to Los Angeles International Airport that an emergency landing would be feasible if Morrison's reaction threatened flight safety. Isabella had returned to her normal duties, but now she was no longer Morrison's victim. She was Damon's primary witness, and her hidden recording device was capturing every word of what would become Morrison's final performance as a Richards Airways employee. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison with a brief announcement. Morrison's voice carried its usual authority over the aircraft's intercom system. We're beginning our initial descent into Los Angeles, and I'll be conducting final crew evaluations before landing. This is standard procedure and will not affect your arrival time, but this announcement would be Morrison's last as captain of any Richards Airways flight. Damon waited exactly 5 minutes before making his move. Using the aircraft's internal communication system, he contacted the cockpit directly with a message that would change everything. Captain Morrison, this is Damon Richards, CEO of Richards Airways. I'm currently aboard your flight as a passenger, and I need to speak with you immediately in the forward galley. The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds as Morrison processed the impossibility of what he had just heard. Then came the response that confirmed his guilt more clearly than any recording could have. Sir, I think there may be some confusion. The passenger manifest shows no one by that name aboard this aircraft. Damon's reply was delivered with the quiet authority of someone who owned everything Morrison could see. Captain Morrison, my real name is David Chen on your passenger list. Seat 3A. I have been aboard this aircraft for the past 4 hours, listening to you systematically abuse my employees. You will report to the forward galley immediately, or I will contact air traffic control and request an emergency landing with federal marshals waiting. The threat was not idle. Damon had built Richards Airways into an industry leader by understanding that some situations required absolute decisiveness, and Morrison's crimes demanded immediate action regardless of the complications involved. When Morrison emerged from the cockpit 3 minutes later, his face had gone pale with the realization that his carefully constructed world was collapsing. The confident swagger that had terrorized crew members for years was replaced by the uncertain movement of someone who suddenly understood they were trapped at 40,000 feet with no escape. The forward galley of Flight 447 had been the site of Morrison's systematic abuse for months, but now it would serve as the setting for his complete destruction. As Morrison entered the confined space where he had terrorized so many employees, he found himself facing the one person in the world who had the power to end his career instantly. Sit down, Captain Morrison. Damon's voice carried the quiet authority of inherited wealth and earned respect. Morrison's attempt to maintain his professional facade crumbled immediately when he saw the recording device in Damon's hand and realized that Isabella was documenting everything from her position near the galley entrance. "Mr. Richards, I think there may be some misunderstanding about—" "There's no misunderstanding," Damon interrupted, his voice cutting through Morrison's attempted deflection like ice. "I heard your conversation with Isabella Chen about her daughter's insurance coverage. I heard you threaten to maintain her part-time status unless she provided sexual favors. I heard you use a child's medical crisis as leverage for coercion. There is no misunderstanding about federal crimes, Captain Morrison." The effect of Damon's words was immediate and devastating. Morrison's face cycled through shock, fear, and finally desperate anger as he realized the magnitude of his exposure. "You can't prove anything," Morrison said, but his voice carried the hollow bravado of someone who knew they were already defeated. "It's her word against mine, and I've got stellar performance reviews from corporate." Damon's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "Actually, Captain Morrison, it's not her word against yours, it's your own recorded confession against you." The recording began to play, filling the small galley with Morrison's own voice, detailing his systematic abuse of crew members. Every threat, every manipulation, every casual reference to using Emma Chen's medical condition as leverage played back with crystal clarity. As Morrison listened to his own words condemning him, Damon continued with the methodical precision of someone who had built an empire by understanding power dynamics completely. "Blake Morrison, you are terminated from Richards Airways effective immediately. You will never work in commercial aviation again. Your pilot's license will be revoked when the Federal Aviation Administration reviews this evidence. Your actions constitute multiple federal crimes, including extortion, sexual coercion, fraud, and conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud." But Damon was not finished. The confrontation that had begun with Morrison's exposure would end with complete justice for every employee he had victimized. "More importantly," Damon continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "Isabella Chen's insurance status will be restored immediately with full retroactive coverage. Her daughter's surgery will be scheduled within the week, and every penny of medical expenses will be covered completely. Every other crew member you've abused will receive full restitution for stolen wages and benefits, and I will personally ensure that anyone you've coerced receives comprehensive support." Morrison's last desperate attempt at self-preservation was as pathetic as it was revealing. "You can't do this to me. I know things about other managers, other operations that would embarrass the company. I can make problems for you if you destroy my career." The threat revealed the full scope of corruption that Morrison represented, but it also sealed his fate completely. "Captain Morrison," Damon said with the quiet finality of someone ending a conversation forever, "you have just admitted to knowledge of additional criminal activity within my company. That makes you not just a perpetrator, but a potential witness in a federal investigation. I suggest you spend your remaining time on this aircraft, considering how cooperative you want to be with the authorities, who will be waiting when we land." The remainder of Flight 447 passed in tense silence, as Morrison remained confined to the crew area under the watchful supervision of senior flight attendant Marcus Thompson, who had volunteered to ensure the terminated captain could not interfere with the aircraft's safe operation. The actual flying was handled by First Officer Jennifer Walsh, whose competence quickly demonstrated that Morrison's presence in the cockpit had been unnecessary for years. As the aircraft began its final approach to Los Angeles International Airport, Damon used the aircraft's communication system to contact Richards Airways corporate security and federal aviation authorities. By the time Flight 447 touched down at LAX, a complete investigation team was waiting, along with federal marshals who would ensure Morrison's immediate arrest. But the most important moment of the entire flight came as passengers began to disembark, when Isabella approached Damon with tears of gratitude rather than desperation. "Mr. Richards," she said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. Emma's surgery will happen," Damon assured her, "and you never have to worry about employment security again. But Isabella, I need to thank you for your courage in speaking up. Without your willingness to trust me with the truth, Morrison would have continued destroying lives indefinitely. The transformation in Isabella's bearing was remarkable to witness. The fear and desperation that had defined her for months were replaced by the confidence of someone who had been heard, believed, and protected by the one person who truly had the power to help her. As Damon deplaned in Los Angeles, he carried with him not just the satisfaction of having exposed corruption, but the deeper understanding that true leadership requires constant vigilance against the predators who disguise themselves as professionals. The investigation that followed Morrison's arrest would reveal a network of abuse that extended far beyond a single flight crew, but it would also demonstrate the power of decisive action when leaders choose courage over comfort. Within 48 hours of Flight 447's arrival in Los Angeles, the transformation of Richards Airways' employee protection protocols would begin in earnest. Damon understood that Morrison's crimes were symptoms of systemic failures that required comprehensive solutions, not just individual punishment. The first changes were immediate and visible. Emma Chen's heart surgery was scheduled at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center with the most qualified pediatric cardiac team on the West Coast, and every expense was covered by a special executive intervention that bypassed normal insurance procedures entirely. More importantly, Isabella was promoted to senior crew coordinator with a salary increase that reflected her years of exceptional service and her courage in exposing Morrison's crimes. But Damon's reforms extended far beyond individual cases. Working with Human Resources Director Rebecca Martinez, he implemented what would become known throughout the aviation industry as the Richards Standard for employee protection. Every crew member would now have direct access to corporate leadership through encrypted communication channels that bypassed regional management entirely. Anonymous reporting systems were established with investigations conducted by independent firms rather than internal departments that might be compromised by personal relationships or career concerns. Most importantly, Damon instituted quarterly undercover evaluations, where senior executives would travel anonymously on Richards Airways flights to observe actual working conditions rather than relying on sanitized reports from middle management. The ripple effects of these changes extended throughout the aviation industry as other airlines rushed to implement similar protections, fearing that their own hidden scandals might be exposed by employees emboldened by Richards Airways' example. Morrison himself became a cautionary tale that resonated far beyond commercial aviation. His trial for federal crimes, including extortion, conspiracy, and violations of civil rights under color of authority, resulted in a 7-year prison sentence that sent a clear message to anyone tempted to abuse their power over vulnerable employees. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Flight 447 was the relationship that developed between Damon and his employees. Word of his willingness to travel undercover and personally investigate problems spread throughout the company, creating a culture where management knew they could be observed at any time by the very people who set company policy. 6 months after Morrison's arrest, I had the privilege of witnessing Damon's address to the annual Richards Airways Employee Conference. The transformation in company culture was evident from the moment he took the stage. Instead of speaking from behind a podium to a carefully selected audience of managers and executives, Damon stood in the center of a circle that included flight attendants, baggage handlers, maintenance crews, and every level of employee who kept the airline operational. 6 months ago, Damon began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed auditorium, I thought I was running a successful airline. Our profits were strong, our customer satisfaction ratings were excellent, and our safety record was impeccable. By every metric that mattered to Wall Street, Richards Airways was soaring. He paused, and I could see the weight of what he had learned reflected in his expression. But I wasn't running a successful airline. I was presiding over a system that allowed predators to flourish while good people suffered in silence. And the most shameful part was that I had no idea it was happening, because I had insulated myself from the reality of what my employees experienced every day. The auditorium remained completely silent as Damon walked the audience through his undercover experience on Flight 447. He spared no detail in describing Morrison's systematic abuse, Isabella's desperate situation, and the revelation that perfect corporate reports had been masking months of criminal behavior. And the truth is, Damon continued, real leadership isn't about commanding from the executive suite. It's about understanding what happens in the aircraft galleys, the maintenance hangars, and the customer service centers where our company's actual work gets done. It's about recognizing that the people closest to our customers often know truths that boardrooms never discover. He gestured toward Isabella, who was seated in the front row wearing the uniform of her new position as senior crew coordinator. Her daughter Emma, now fully recovered from her successful heart surgery, sat beside her mother with the bright smile of a healthy 8-year-old who had no idea how close she had come to tragedy. Today, Emma Chen is alive and healthy because her mother had the courage to trust someone with the truth about what was happening to her. But Emma should never have been in danger in the first place. Her mother's loyalty and exceptional service should have guaranteed the medical coverage that saved her life, not put it at risk. The presentation continued with concrete results that demonstrated how fundamental change could be achieved when leadership chose to prioritize people over profit margins. Employee satisfaction scores had increased by 47%, voluntary turnover had dropped to historic lows, and most remarkably, customer satisfaction had risen alongside employee well-being, proving that treating workers well enhanced rather than diminished service quality. But the most significant change was cultural. Throughout the aviation industry, the Richard Standard had become synonymous with employee protection and authentic leadership. Other airlines had adopted similar undercover evaluation programs, anonymous reporting systems, and direct access policies that bypassed potentially corrupt middle management. "We've proven," Damon said as his presentation reached its conclusion, "that doing right by our employees isn't just morally correct, it's profitable. Companies that prioritize worker well-being see improvements in every metric that matters: productivity, customer loyalty, safety records, and long-term profitability." As applause filled the auditorium, Damon raised his hand for silence one final time. But this story isn't really about Richards Airways. It's about every company, every leader, every person who has the power to make someone else's day better or worse. 6 months ago, I heard someone crying at 40,000 feet and decided to investigate. That moment of basic human curiosity changed everything, not just for Isabella and Emma, not just for our company, but for thousands of workers across the aviation industry. He looked directly into the cameras that were broadcasting his remarks live to employee locations worldwide. So here's my challenge to every leader watching this. When was the last time you really listened to the people who work for you, not in a scripted meeting or a sanitized survey, but really listened? When did you last see your workplace through the eyes of someone who can't afford to lose their job? The final slide appeared on the screens around the auditorium. A photo of Emma Chen's artwork, a colorful drawing of an airplane with the words, "Thank you for saving Mommy," written in a child's careful handwriting. Real leadership means lifting others up, especially when nobody's watching. It means using your power to protect people, not profit from their vulnerability. And it means having the courage to admit when your systems are broken and the determination to fix them. Damon stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had learned the most important lesson of his career. The person crying in that galley could be in your company right now. The question is, will you hear them? And more importantly, will you act? As thunderous applause filled the auditorium, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from witnessing justice achieved through courage and decisive action. But beyond satisfaction was something deeper, the recognition that true wealth lies not in accumulating power, but in using it to protect those who cannot protect themselves. After the presentation, as employees lined up to share their own stories of transformation and gratitude, a young maintenance supervisor approached Damon with a question that crystallized everything we had learned. "Mr. Richards," the young man said, "I've heard rumors that other airlines have problems similar to what Captain Morrison was doing. What happens to those employees who don't have someone like you willing to go undercover and investigate?" Damon's answer revealed the vision that would define the next phase of his leadership. "That's exactly why we're launching the Aviation Worker Protection Initiative next month. We're creating an industry-wide anonymous reporting system, funding independent investigations at companies that request our assistance, and establishing legal support for aviation workers who face retaliation for reporting abuse." The young supervisor's eyes widened as he processed the implications. "You're going to help workers at competing airlines? Competition in business should be about providing better service and innovation," Damon replied, "not about who can exploit their workers more effectively. When we raise the standard for worker treatment across the entire industry, everyone benefits: companies, employees, and passengers." That evening, as I helped Damon prepare for the flight back to New York, I reflected on how profoundly the events of the past 6 months had changed not just Richards Airways, but my understanding of what constitutes true leadership in the modern era. In my decades of service to the ultra-wealthy, I had observed many forms of power: political influence, financial manipulation, social connections, and technological dominance. But Damon Richards had demonstrated something far more rare and valuable: the power that comes from aligning privilege with responsibility, wealth with justice, and authority with compassion. "Winston," Damon said as we settled into his private aircraft for the journey home, "I've been thinking about expanding our undercover evaluation program beyond just our own company. What would you think about creating a consulting division that helps other corporations identify and eliminate systematic abuse within their organizations?" The question represented the logical evolution of everything we had learned from Flight 447. If the techniques that had exposed Morrison's crimes could be systematized and applied across multiple industries, the potential impact would extend far beyond aviation. "I believe, sir," I replied, "that you may have discovered your true calling, not just as a business leader, but as someone who uses wealth and influence to create systematic change in how organizations treat their most vulnerable employees." Damon nodded thoughtfully, already envisioning the infrastructure that would be required to scale such an operation. "We'll need investigators who can blend into different workplace environments, legal experts who understand employment law across multiple jurisdictions, and most importantly, the absolute commitment to follow through on every case, regardless of the political or financial complications involved." As our aircraft climbed into the evening sky over Los Angeles, I contemplated the ripple effects that would flow from this decision. Companies across America would soon discover that their treatment of employees might be subject to unexpected scrutiny by people with both the resources and the determination to expose systematic abuse. But more importantly, millions of workers would gain a powerful ally in their struggle against the predators who had operated in shadows for too long. The transformation of Damon Richards from successful CEO to champion of worker rights had begun with a single moment of curiosity about why someone was crying at 40,000 feet. That curiosity had led to investigation. Investigation had revealed injustice, and injustice had demanded action. Now, that same pattern would be replicated across dozens of industries, protecting countless employees who had never imagined that anyone with real power would care enough to listen to their stories. 1 year after Flight 447, Isabella Chen stood before a congressional subcommittee investigating workplace abuse in the transportation industry. Her testimony, delivered with the confidence of someone who had been heard and believed by the one person who could help her, would lead to federal legislation strengthening protections for aviation workers nationwide. Emma Chen, now 9 years old and completely healthy, sat in the gallery watching her mother help other families avoid the nightmare they had barely survived. The little girl's presence served as a reminder of what was truly at stake when leaders chose courage over comfort, justice over profit, and action over indifference. But perhaps the most significant legacy of that October flight was the example it set for leaders across every industry. The story of how one CEO's decision to listen rather than assume, investigate rather than trust reports, and act rather than delay had saved a child's life and transformed an entire company culture. In boardrooms across America, executives began asking themselves uncomfortable questions about what might be happening in their own organizations while they focused on quarterly reports and shareholder meetings. Some hired consulting firms to conduct independent audits. Others implemented direct communication channels that bypassed traditional management hierarchies. A few even began their own undercover investigations, following Damon's example of experiencing their companies from the perspective of their most vulnerable employees. The revolution in workplace protection that began with Isabella's tears at 40,000 feet continued to spread, one converted leader at a time, proving that individual acts of courage could indeed change entire systems when they were backed by the determination to see justice done. As I complete this account in my study overlooking Central Park, I'm reminded of the fundamental truth that has guided my years of service to America's most powerful families. Wealth without compassion is merely accumulation, but wealth combined with justice becomes a force that can transform the world. Damon Richards discovered that truth in an aircraft galley, listening to the desperate sobs of a woman whose daughter's life hung in the balance. His decision to act on what he heard that night changed not just Isabella and Emma Chen's future, but the future of every worker who would benefit from the protections his actions inspired. The lesson for anyone who possesses power, whether as a CEO, a manager, or simply someone who can influence the conditions under which others work, is elegantly simple. The person crying in the bathroom, the galley, or the break room might be closer than you think, and they are counting on someone like you to care enough to act. Because in the end, true wealth is not measured by what you can accumulate for yourself, but by what you can accomplish for others when you choose to use your advantages in service of justice rather than personal gain. And these are stories you should never hear, but need to know.